Hey guys, it's Baban and I'm back with another speed draw thing, and today I'm painting this handsome boy. So let's get going. Now prepare yourselves, clench, because you're going to see how awful this thing starts off right now. Here we go. Now he looks quite awful at the end. I think he looks a bit too goofy, but my god does he look doofy at the start. I don't really like to start off with super clean sketches because it's kind of easier to work out if the thing's going to work if you do a really crappy sketch. Just to get all the basics for the composition, everything down, you can see I've done a couple of swirly little shapes so that I can figure out where the eye's going to be led around it because of the shapes that I've got. So I'm just trying to figure it out more compositionally first before I actually go in and noodle anything out and make it look decent. In the long term, this saves you a lot of time because, I mean, I can crap out something like this, like the sketch I started with, in under a minute. So if you can figure out compositionally from a sketch that takes under a minute, like kind of like a figure drawing, just a quick swervy one, then it's going to save you a lot of time with like having issues with that once you start trying to noodle it out a little bit more, because when you're trying to worry about the specifics like this, trying to block the form out, you don't want to be having to change it too much. But yeah, my first priority when I'm starting something is to just make it more dynamic and not worry at all about having it look good or be like completely accurate in terms of the shape. I just need to get all the different curves of the lines down and figure out how the composition is going to work. Because it doesn't matter how nicely rendered your thing is, if the composition isn't right, it's not going to look amazing. And it doesn't matter how bad the sketch is, the composition is still going to be readable, and that's going to like obviously read, so it doesn't really matter if you do a crappy sketch as long as you can read the composition. Which is why I've spent quite a long time trying to get these lily pads in the right place, because I want a decent amount of bits showing through, because I'm going to put all the stems from them coming through the water underneath, but I also want to have a little bit of indication of the perspective that we've got going on so that it isn't just completely like flat. I want them to be adhering to the plane that I've set up for the water, and I'm also trying to go for a little bit of fisheye lens, especially around the front, so that we've got a little bit of a curve rather than having it be incredibly angular. And I'm going to try and play that up a bit more once I put the water in. And you can see I kind of move these lily pads around a little bit with the mesh transformation so that I could dip them down a little bit in the middle to play more into that curve. And you can see first I put down a bit of a grid over the top to figure out how I wanted the perspective to look and the plane that this all these lily pads are going to be sat on, and that the tiger is going to be kind of poking through, which is a really useful reference because the lily pads are circular, they are quite difficult to draw like on their own, especially at different angles, but when you're trying to adhere them all to this one plane, that can be quite difficult. But having just like basic squares blocked out and seeing like different curves of them, it's a little bit easier to be able to place them onto that. So now I've got those down, I'm going back to the tiger, and I've got this wireframe that I've done underneath after getting all the other perspectives sorted, and I'm starting to noodle him out in a bit more of a cleaner sketch now, and I'm going to add his stripes on after that. Now, an issue that I had with the drawing was I was kind of bringing his cheeks down a little bit too much, like the fuzz on the cheeks pushes back a little bit more. It doesn't really splay out as much as I've drawn it at the moment, but I go and fix that a bit later. Something else that I think looks off is that his ears kind of seem a bit too big to me, and maybe like a little bit too far apart, which is something that is still evident in the finished thing, which I don't really approve of. That's something like an issue I have with it. I'm trying not to just crap on it too much, but yeah, I don't think it's that amazing. I'm not really into this one. I think the stripes look okay. I quite enjoyed putting stripes on, but again, I don't think they wrapped around the face in the right kind of shape. But again, that's something I go and fix in later when I'm actually painting it and do the overpainting. And I'm just checking again the composition, which is a little bit difficult when you've just got a sketch, so I'm blocking everything in really quick just to see how it looks in terms of the main shapes that are going to be showing, and thinking about where I'm going to want to add in water lilies and stuff later. And now that I've got that how I want it, I'm just doing some line art so that I've got something to select around and like invert the selection, then it's a bit easier for me to fill it in instead of having to go and draw all the shapes out. I've also got like a cleaner definition of the shapes to use over the top when I'm painting, so that when I'm putting all the like base details in, just painting it so that the shape's understandable, it's easy for me to see what I've got underneath through it. Like, it's not any messy sketch, so it's not going to be affecting any of the colours underneath too much with all the loose lines that are about. So I've got those, and then we're going to do the tiger as well, so we can select around him and get his base. And I don't actually end up using any of the lines in the final thing, it's just so I've got a clean reference for everything when I'm trying to paint, so I can just put the lines over the top, and like I said, it's not going to interfere with any of the colours that I'm painting on, or in this case the like greys that I'm painting on, because I'm doing this all in grayscale because I need to try again with the gradient maps, see how I can work from grayscale and then transferring that to something that's coloured. I've done a couple of other videos on the same kind of thing and using that in the past, so I'll put a link to those at the end of this video. And anyway, now that I've got all my base down for everything, I've got the shape of the tiger laid out, I've got the shape of the lilies laid out, it's time for me to start noodling at it a little bit and putting all the lighting on. Now the tiger is a little bit awkward to do because obviously you've got two colours going on and they are two different values. So we've got the white that's going to be a little bit lighter, and we've also got this orange that's just by nature a little bit darker, because the colours that go more to red, they tend to be a bit darker like in value. And as they go more towards yellow, they get a bit lighter, so I also want to include a little bit of where there's going to be yellow highlights in this orange, or like a little bit of a gradient from orange to yellow. I also have to put on these stripes, so when I put those on, I need to also pay attention because they're not all going to be the same kind of black. They're going to have like different kind of values as there's more light hitting them, so they're going to get a little bit more grey. But they need to still be darker than all the colours that are underneath them in this, where the orange and the white's going to be. So they can't be too light, but they still need to be not completely black because it's going to kind of kill it a bit too much. Now what I'm doing is, since I've got this cleaned up version that's only really defining the edge of the tiger, I've still got the last sketch underneath with the stripes on it, so I'm just making a new layer with the stripes that's a little bit more clean and is one that I'm actually going to use in the final thing. Now these lines are quite solid at the moment, but once I start doing the painting, I go back to this layer and erase them and add a little bit more on, slightly with more fuzzy fur brushes, so that it's got less of a harsh edge to it and kind of blends in with the texture of the rest of the fur. You can see I'm also slowly painting the lily pads in. I've still got that line art layer over the top, but it's a bit of a lower opacity, but it's just so I can get in where the main details are, like where the split in the lily pad is and any places where I've got where the water is going to come onto them and overlap with them. But once I've got all this blocked out, I'm going to get rid of the line art and just go and paint it in by myself, noodle it in, because I don't need the lines anymore. You can also see I've put a little bit of a test layer in for the water, and the way I did that was to make a glow layer, I think it is, reduce the opacity, and I've just put a little bit of a gradient with the airbrush on in different places to noodle it out and give it a bit more shape. There's a little bit of like shadow under the tiger and where all the water's moving about, where I've just cut into it by erasing it. I've also made sure that there's a clear definition of where this water is wrapping around the tiger, so anywhere that's underneath the water is becoming a little bit darker and the light's a little bit more dispersed, because that's what water does to the light, but anything that's above the water has got a little bit more direct light and harsher shadows on it. You'll be able to see in the lily pads that are under the water, as well as the stems, they'll be a little bit less harshly lit. I'm also keeping this water to a separate layer, because to do it all on one layer along with the background would just be a nightmare, because of the way I want all these highlights to go over the top of everything, and I want what's underneath to be showing through. I also want the water to have a little bit of opacity to it, like it's not completely clear, so everything that's underneath is going to have like a slight bit of tint from it, because of the water that's between like the thing and the surface, to give a little bit of a more clear indication that it is submerged. So like if something's far away in space, then it gets a little bit more blue because there's so much like air and space in between it. But if it's underwater, especially like murky water, the further away from you it gets in the water, the less clear it is to see. So I'm gonna tint everything a bit towards the watercolor, but I want it to be like a tiny little bit, so it's got a bit of like body and murkiness to it. So like I say, that's going to make sure that nothing really has too much light hitting it, or not as much as on the surface. So I've kind of got a gradient on the back of the tiger where there's going to be more water between its back, or like its back end or the back of its tail and the surface, but there's not going to be as much like directly where the edge of the water is on it. So it's a bit lighter there, so where this front paw's coming forward, there's not much between it and the top of the water there, so that's a little bit lighter than the other one that's underneath and the back of its tail. Now I've got a little bit of a base for everything. Everything's painted in to the point where I can get rid of the line art. I don't really need it anymore. I can start trying to noodle this out as it is. So what I'm doing now is going and redoing the water. We're going to have a little bit of shadow underneath where the lily pads are, because you get a bit of water tension and it kind of curves the way the water goes, so there's going to be a little bit where the light isn't going to hit. We're also going to get that around the tiger, and the way that he's moving through the water is going to push it and make little waves, so we're going to get these curves of the water in the water, and there's going to be a pinnacle of the wave where the water's going to hit, and we're going to get a strong highlight, and there's going to be a bit that kind of tapers off into the curve, and then there's going to be the other side of the curve where there's not going to be any light hitting, so we're going to get a shadow, and in the shadows we're going to be able to see through the water, because if there isn't any light to hit the water, then you can't really like see it. You're just going to see whatever's underneath because it is clear. I'm also trying to get that onto these lily pads, so we've got around the edge of this water there's going to be like a little indication of where the shadow is, where the water is kind of going to have a little bit of a shadow and it's not really going to reflect anything, so that's just defining the edges of those. I'm also putting a few little water droplets onto them to make them seem like maybe it's been raining, or there's been like a bit more splashing about around there, or it's just generally a little bit more of a damp climate. I'm also trying to account for the different colours that I want to put into the lily pads, because they're going to be, the base of them is going to be green, but they're also going to have these little edges that are varying more towards yellows and oranges to reflect the colours in the tiger, where the lily pads are going to be decaying a little bit. On the lily pads, I'm also trying to not make them too dark. They need to look a bit of like they've got a sheen, they're kind of shiny, so there's quite a lot of a light tone on them. And now I'm just starting to go noodle those in a little bit more, because there's a whole lot of them. They actually took longer than I would have expected, but it looks kind of awkward if there's something that's the main focus and you only paint that out and noodle it a lot, but you don't really go noodle everything else to the same sort of extent, especially if it's something that's in focus or around the main subject. Something that people are also asking, I did this mostly during streams, like a whole lot of different streams over about a week. People were asking like, how long is it taking you to do this? How long does this kind of thing take? Generally with my videos, because of the time that I speed them up to, it's around an hour equals a minute. So this took way longer than I expected or wanted it to. I wanted it to take maybe around 20 hours, but it ended up taking maybe like 23, which I think I'm kind of disappointed with. I'm especially considering the end result that I'm not too happy with. I don't think I would have minded if I kind of liked the end result, but I'm not that into this. I think what might have made me take a little bit longer was that I was mostly doing this on stream, like I said, so that tends to slow me down a little bit, because I'm trying to pay attention to the chat and trying to actually like reply to people at the same time, so that slows me down a little bit. If I'm on my own, I think it might have taken me a bit less time. It was also incredibly warm the week that I did this. We had some kind of heat wave and it was probably hot enough to fry an egg on my computer, so I kind of had to have the windows shut as well in case the neighbours thought I was mental talking to myself. So it was very, very uncomfortable, but I was determined to get it done regardless. Anyway, yeah, adding lots and lots of little water droplets onto these lily pads. I don't think I noodle the ones in the back too much because they're a little bit more out of focus. They don't really need to have that much attention paid to them because like they're not the focus and they were probably going to get blurred out anyway. Just testing a little bit on this tiger's face to see how I can blend out the stripes on him so that they're not as strong. With a couple of different brushes, I think I was washing them out a little bit with the airbrush and then using more of a textured fur brush to put in a bit of a grain to the fur to show which way it was going, and also to kind of bite into the shape that I already had, because you don't want like a really sharp edged shape when you're trying to draw fur. I'm also on his front paw trying to make it seem as though there is a bit of a movement to the fur because of the way the water's kind of swooshing over it. So there's little bits I've pulled out that have got a bit more kind of pointiness and shape to them that are being dragged over the darker bits of fur. And I think it was around this point I was deciding that I didn't really like the shape of his like the ruff around his face of fur too much, so I start kind of biting into that and putting more shadows onto it, changing the shape a little bit so that it works better. Just trying to carve it into a bit more of the shape that I think it should be instead of something that looks really round and doofy. So starts to look a little bit better at this point, but I still don't think I'm very happy with it, especially his face. Feel free to rip on it down in the comments. I do like to kind of stylize things a little bit, but I don't think I just don't think it looks that great. Anyway, now that I've got all these stripes noodled out a little bit, I'm starting to go in and pick at the rest of the fur by giving it a little bit more texture, putting in more shadows to define the shapes a little bit better, redoing his eyes, painting those in, putting a lot more fur texture into the rest of him. It was quite painty at the moment, but I go and add in more fur texture to him. I'm making sure to flip him either side so that I can see it from a different perspective from time to time and make sure that everything's on the right kind of path. That all the angles are looking right. It starts to get a little bit difficult to talk when you've been going for so long. Anyway, yeah, I've got a little bit more of a textured brush in now. I think it's just the ink brush that I like to use for sketching. I'm starting to noodle out that a little bit and put a bit of fuzz on him so that he's got a little bit more texture, especially around the sides of his face, to kind of wash it out a little bit so that it isn't as sharp. Like I mentioned before, you can see all the little lily pads that are sort of shooting up from under the water. They aren't as detailed, they aren't as bright. I also go and add in a few little hints that there are fish swimming around, so just little like flecks of light that are swimming about in the water, but I think that might be a bit later in the process. Starting to paint him in a little bit more, make him look like a little bit less dopey by bringing the sides of his eyes up a bit more. I think he looks a bit less kind of like he's apologizing for something now. He looks a bit more like a proud tiger. Just putting a bit more dark color over the top of everything to even it out a little bit. Everything was a little bit flat, so I want to bring the edges in a little bit with, I think it's called a vignette when you kind of darken around the edges, just to make the focus a little bit more in the center of it. And going in again and noodling this water out a little bit more. I wasn't sure how strong I wanted it, but I kind of figured it out after a while for it to be kind of equal where you can see the water, but also where it's got enough sheen on the top to be able to tell that it is water. Going and adding in the gradient maps. Now what you do with this is kind of add different colours in and they apply to the different values as it kind of goes up the scale. So what I'm doing is I've got a separate layer for the orange of the tiger and I've got a separate layer for just the white, which I've turned a little bit more yellowish, and all I've done is gone and erased the orange parts where I want the white to show through from underneath. And I'm just doing this with each different layer for the colours that I want it to be. I've also put a hard light layer just over the top of some of the tigers so that we can see these darker parts towards where his arms and his back are kind of fading away into the colour of the water, again to show that there's a little bit of depth and space in between the top of the water and where the tiger is underneath. Now this was actually the main intent for doing this. I wanted to have a go again at gradient maps by painting something in greyscale and then colouring it in with this so that it's a little bit easier for me to paint and do it in the future and just like develop the style a bit. Like I mentioned before, with these lily pads, I'm starting to put a little bit of orange and red yellows around the edges of them where they're decaying slightly and there's holes in them, to kind of reflect the colours that I've got in the tiger, bring that into the rest of the picture so that it isn't just like a big orange blob in a sea of green and blues. And just messing about with the lily pads underneath the water to check that they are still being like bright enough to see through, and they've got a little bit of colour to them but not too much. They're a little bit monotone at the moment, so I go in and add a little bit more of a yellow green to them. After doing that, I also decided that I didn't really like the way that the water looked, so I reduced the opacity on it quite a lot and decided to go in and add in just the highlights of it to exaggerate the shapes of it a little bit, to give it a bit more interest, because it looks a little bit dull in the spaces where there's only really the water and what's underneath. So I thought this looked a little bit more interesting. It does look a bit more kind of flat, but I think it gives a lot more interest to it. I really like the kind of shapes that you get with it. Like I said, with the water tension, the way that it kind of wraps around things and you get these tapered kind of points coming out and they like swoosh around and swerve at different like line weights and stuff. I get really into drawing water. It's not like super realistic water, but I prefer something a bit more stylized like this. I'm also washing it out a little bit in different places and just having it as a bit of a glow layer over the top of all the other little gradients that I've got to show the shape of the water. And now I'm just going on to the tiger and putting some highlights on him and painting him out a little bit more with the colours now that I've got those on. Once I have got all the colours down for everything, I don't usually have everything completely finished. What I'll do is make sure the colours are all right how I want them, and then I'll make a new layer and go and paint over the top of that, which is what I also did with the grayscale. Once I had all the greys correct, I went and just grabbed them with the selector and painted on any other little details that I wanted over the top and then layered it down. Anyway, yeah, I kind of stylized his whiskers a little bit to make them look like they had water droplets on the end, just to make it a bit more interesting again. I think it looks kind of cool when you do that with whiskers. And everything's about finished now. I just wanted to add some water lilies in. I wasn't really happy with the way that it looked because it does look a little bit empty, so I had to add something else in to make it a bit more interesting. I was kind of fed up of it at this point, but I thought it's not going to take me too long to add these in, so I'll just go and put them in and it'll make it look like 10 times better, kind of bring it together a little bit more. It's also going to kind of reflect the little bit of pink that he's got in his nose into these lilies as well, so we've got like a couple of different colours that are being used in multiple places, so we're building up a little bit more of a colour scheme in it rather than just having these blues and greens. I'm also just doing these on one layer, so I've blocked out the basic shape of them and then I'm just going and noodling them in with all the greys and stuff. I'm not spending too long on these because by the time I got to them I was super duper fed up of this. I just wanted it finished. So the ones in the back aren't noodled out too much, but the ones at the front are a bit more finished. I also didn't want to make them look like huge and take up too much of what I already had, so I decided to make them kind of small and dainty and just have them as little hints of kind of a pinkish colour in all this green. I'm also adding a few little water droplets just onto the tiger to say that maybe he's been in like fully in the water, and he's got a couple of little dabbles around like the end of his tail where it's definitely been in the water and around his back and everything. And lastly, just putting a gradient map onto these and adding a little bit of differentiation in the colours to reflect the other ones that are around it. And there we go, it's finished. I will put links down in the description and on the screen to where you can get prints of this handsome boy on Redbubble and TEEPUBLIC. Yeah, I hope this helped. If it did, give us a like, share if you think it'll help someone else, and subscribe for new videos on Fridays. There's a link down in the description to my Discord group where you can come and chat out stuff. I'll also put a link to where I post stuff, as well as where you can buy other prints. And lastly, there's a couple of links to videos that I mentioned before about doing gradient maps on grayscale stuff. Yeah, I hope this helped. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye!